Hey everybody, this is Ken from Nippon Bro. How's it going? Hope you guys are having a great day. You guys are back for episode 2 of Editing Photos 101 for Beginners, and today we are talking about contrast. And after this short intro, we are getting right into it. Welcome back, guys. So today we are talking about contrast, and before we get into contrast and talking about it, I highly recommend you go see the episode 1, which has everything to do with exposure. So if you guys haven't seen that one, I highly recommend you check it out. I'll link it up here and in the description down below. Check that out before you come take a look at this one, just because we are going in orders of things. So if you want to see the exposure, then we're going on contrast and so on and so forth, and you can follow along with me in your editing program. And most editing programs work for this. I'm using Lightroom Classic. You can use Lightroom CC or Affinity or Luminar, any of the programs that you edit your photos in. As long as it follows the exposure, contrast, and all those sliders that you see in your software, you can follow along with this tutorial. All right, so let's just get right into it. So contrast, what is it? It means a couple different things in terms of what it does for camera wise and what it does for editing wise. And these two are a little different, but they do relate to one another. So contrast consists of tones and colors. And this is the actual meaning of contrast, so not to do with editing right now, but as long as you know what contrast is, this will relate to when you take photos, and then it'll translate into when you do editing. So when I say tone and colors, the tone, it has to do with the brightness and the darkness of the photo. And then the color is the warm and the cool, but don't get that mixed up with white balance, because white balance is something completely different. It's a little similar to actually the cool colors and the warm colors, but there's tonal, warm, and cool colors, and I'm just going to explain that in a little bit here. Now, of course, there's many different ways of actually comparing contrast and contrast and explaining it to you. But I mean, I don't want to really get these charts out and start showing you different things, because that gets way too technical. And I'm a visual person, but when it comes to even visual tech, it's really hard to understand unless you know how to read the graphs. So I'm not showing any graphs today. I'm actually showing you just raw examples of what you would see when you take a photo and upload it into Lightroom or any of your editing software. And we're just going to go right through it, and I'm going to show you what it is, black and white. All right, so let's get a little bit deeper into the meaning of contrast and show you some examples of what it actually means. So the first one I said was tonal contrast. So tonal contrast is the brightness and the darkness of a photo. But when you adjust the actual contrast of a photo for brightness and darkness, it can get a little confusing when I just say it in words. So I'm going to show you what it actually does. But when you think of brightness and darkness, some people might think exposure, kind of like what I talked about in my previous episode. Now, don't get mixed up with contrast of tonal brightness and darkness with exposure, darkness, and brightness, because they're totally different things. So let me just show you with a black and white photo, and you will see the actual difference in what contrast does compared to what exposure does. But again, brightness and darkness, as long as you have something dark with something light in the photo, that is contrast. So contrast means the difference between the bright and dark to give whatever you're trying to, let's say you're trying to light up a subject like a portrait of a person. Now you're lighting that person up with a light, so that gives a brightness contrast to the person. But then you want the background to be dark to give separation between the background and the foreground, which is your subject. Now, you don't want to not light your subject and then make the background lit, because that just kind of defeats the purpose unless that's the look that you're going for. But in all essence, for essential wise, you're trying to light up whoever or whatever you're trying to take a photo of, and then you're trying to create a separation and create a dark part in your image to give it more light. So again, when it comes to photo editing, that's a technique that a lot of people use to kind of focus the viewer's eyes onto the subject. So again, let me just show you real quick of what I mean. All right, guys, so again, contrast and what it's all about. Here we go, an example for you. Contrast slider is right here under exposure. Again, that's an episode that I did before, so I highly recommend you check that one out first before you come to this one. And contrast is, again, the tonal contrast that I'm explaining is better explained in a black and white photo, because you get to understand exactly what it does. So tonal contrast is brightness and darkness. So what it does is it accentuates the blacks, and when you go the other way, it'll accentuate the highlights or the whites. So again, This is exactly what would happen if you take a black and white photo like this one. Let me actually do a reference in active like I always do here. So okay, this is the before and this is what I'm working with. So again, let's just crank this contrast slider up all the way, and you're gonna notice something different here. You're gonna actually notice the image and the bright parts get brighter and then the dark parts get darker. So let's check it out. So again, it's a little bit hard of a difference, but you can see the whites here a little bit more blown out. Let me zoom in here, both same. This kind of light is a bit more lighter here, but it's also because there is the darkness of the shadows that just got darker. On here, you can actually see the fact that the rock has a bit more texture here. But on this one, now you can't see the texture on some of these right here. You can see a little bit here, but that's because the light source is here and it's making it glow. But again, that's what contrast exactly does. So if you move it to the right, it's gonna add contrast. That means it's going to make the blacks blacker and then the whites whiter. And then now if you go to the opposite, we'll see here. Let's try sliding this contrast all the way down now. Now you kind of get this washed out, a little bit flatter looking vintage look that sometimes people go for. Now again, exposure sometimes does a similar thing, but exposure is completely different because what it does is it actually basically just takes the entire image and makes it brighter or darker. But let's see what it does here in terms of this photo on black and white. Now I'm just going to set this contrast back to 0. Now we're just going to play around with the exposure. All right, so exposure, brighten it. We're going to go all the way. Now you're barely able to see the water, nothing. It's all lost information here. Now again, we're just going to go down exposure and go all the way dark, and everything turns dark. This is not what contrast does. Contrast accentuates the blacks and accentuates the whites. And on the other hand, if you go down on the left, it just basically takes away all the blacks and the whites. So it looks just really dead. There's no dynamic range or anything to kind of separate the blacks and the whites. So if you go to the left here, it's just going to take away everything, so it looks a little bit more flatter. Again, this is a more vintage look, so if you're looking at this photo right now and you say, hey, you know what, that looks pretty good, well then, you know, right along with it and just post it on your Instagram. That's totally fine. Again, contrast and exposure difference, really key important thing to learn, and I would highly recommend you just kind of take that difference. Now I'm going to show you some other examples and on color photos. All right, so now we're going to go into color contrast. So what is color contrast? Color contrast is based off of two different factors in color. So one is the actual cool tone and the warm tones. Now, usually cool tones and warm tones complement each other just because when you are trying to focus a subject or something in your photo that you want the viewers to see, you can use either the warm and cool and combine it with them so the background can be cool and the foreground can be warm, just to kind of give it more dynamic into the photo. The other one is actually to use different shades of the same color. So if you happen to have a green and then you had green leaves in all these photos, which I am going to show you an example of, now you can use the same color green but have different shades, so that just makes it more dynamic, more depth of field, so you can kind of get more life to the photo. If it happened to be all flat in the same color, well then you're just gonna have a really dead photo. Not to say that that isn't a certain style that you're going for, but if you want to make it feel like you're actually there in person and you want to have that more 3D effect to a 2D photo, that's what you're going to want to do, is to create a little bit of depth. Let's get on the computer and I'm going to show you some examples. So take a look at this photo. This is stock footage. I didn't take this photo. I don't even know where this is, to be honest, but this is a very, very good example of color contrast. The sun is shining from the left over here, and basically you have the blue sky, you got the white snow, and the white even has a little bit of yellow and a little bit of blue here. So it kind of gives it that kind of vibe here. Now even this shadow gives it contrast, but main focus here is the cabins. The cabins here are actually lit with a little bit of orange, so you can kind of see the brown and the green there that's actually shining on that wood. So that is giving it contrast. Now if these cabins were, for whatever reason, they were blue, now you wouldn't get that much contrast with it. It's just going to look very flat. And this is how color contrast works. Now, of course, if you try to go on your slider here, let's take a look and see what it does. What it's going to do is all these shadows here and all the dark parts of the photo is going to get darker, and all the light parts where kind of like the snow is shining here, and then the trees where the light is hitting, and even the cabin side here, that is going to get brighter. So take a look at what happens when I go to the right here. And as you can see, that photo actually looks a little better just by doing that. It gives it a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit more depth and feeling, and you can kind of really feel how cold it is there, and the sun is just maybe warm coming through the light there. But again, let's go through the other side and take it on the other side of the spectrum. Now, if you go like this, it looks kind of like that magazine vibe. Now, you're taking away kind of like that warm feeling. Everything kind of looks a little neutral and flat. So again, this is another look that you can go for, but again, it's up to your taste. Whatever you think is good, so be it. Now I kind of want to show you guys another photo here, and this has something to do with color contrast as well, but with the same color. So if you kind of go with the green leaves, you can, depending on how the light shines, and you're going to have a little bit of orange and yellow in there, but these are green leaves, and you got different shades here just because of where the light is shining. Again, if you go to the contrast slider and you move that to the right, the dark parts are going to get darker, and then the light parts are going to get lighter. So again, let's do that. So as you see here, the light just kind of remained the same. This part got darker, so let's go here. So again, take a look at this, and got darker. Again, I will show you with the backslash here. So before and after. So again, this is something that you guys will learn with color tones, and you can have the same color, but at least have a little bit of kind of depth between it by increasing contrast a little bit to give it that kind of difference with a different color. If you go back here and go all the way to the left, now all the green is just going to be green. You have a little bit of a shade difference, but it just looks super flat. And this is not a flattering look when it comes to client work or even your own taste. It just kind of gives it that dead look. And especially when you are shooting raw, you have this dynamic range that you can play with. So play with it, get creative, and get out there, shoot some photos, and start playing around with contrast. All right, so the last thing for contrast is texture contrast. Texture contrast is something that we kind of do without knowing, and it's not that something you need to actually keep in mind of doing, but just know that certain textures, if you put something that's smooth surface next to something that is kind of rugged and rough, then it kind of gives it contrast. You know, if you have two smooth surfaces, it just looks very flat. So if you have something that is textured and something that is smooth or smoother than what it is on the rough texture, then that gives it a little bit more contrast for every photo. So for example, let's go back to this photo. You have the leaves here, and the leaves have this texture. It has these lines kind of engraved into the leaf. That is texture. Texture here where the actual leaf has a stem here, and you can see kind of like the dark line here, and this is all texture. These webs here, texture. Now the background is smooth, right? So you have this background that is blurred out nice and smooth, and then now you have these leaves that are textured, that are a little bit edgy in the photo, sharp. So that gives it that separation. Just imagine if the leaves are blurry. Well, then you just have a complete blurred image. There's no actual texture in there at all. So that is what texture contrast is, and that's something that we do unknowingly when we focus on something, especially if you're taking macro lens photography. Those close-up shots, you're doing it automatically. I mean, you're taking something close up, but you want to get that subject real close and blur the background. So you want that separation, that dynamic range. But just a tip on contrast in general, the more colors you have in a photo, it actually starts distracting the person's eye. So it kind of gets this psychedelic type of vibe in the human brain, and some people don't take it well, and their focus just shifts around with all these different colors and textures, and it's just overwhelming. So basically, the fewer the colors that you have, so if you have only 2 colors, 3 colors, 4, then that is more appealing than having 100 different colors in the photo, just because it is almost overwhelming. And unless there's a smooth gradient to it, like a sky, so if you have kind of golden hour sky and the sky is kind of pinky, purple, blue, and you have this kind of like nice gradient going, then it's soothing to the eye. But when you have these hard divided lines in between each color and they're actually contrasting too much from cool to warm, then it gets really just unbelievably overwhelming to the human eye. All right, so what was the whole point of learning contrast in a different term of other than just sliding the actual slider in Lightroom? Well, basically what I just explained to you with tonal contrast, with color contrast, with texture contrast, these are things to keep out for when you are sliding the slider. Because the more you go to the right, the more accentuated the texture is going to be, the more accentuated the color is going to be, and the more accentuated the actual tone of the dark and the light stuff in the photos. This video is concluding contrast here, and if you guys want to see the next video I will be posting, just turn on those notifications so you are aware when I post them, because this is going to be a continuing series until I finish the beginners part, and maybe I'll do an intermediate and advanced editing for Lightroom as well, but that will be something that I'll be working on. I'm not sure when, but that is something that I am thinking of doing. But if you want that, just request in the comments below and I'll think about it. So if you're new to the channel as well, please subscribe. It helps me out a lot. It justifies me doing these tutorials for you for free and to be able to give back to you guys. And smash a like button on this video if you did like it and if you thought it was helpful. Please share this video to anyone who is beginning photography, that wants to get into it, that wants to get into editing. As well as you can go on the playlist in my channel and you will see the Editing Photos 101, and that can be shared with anyone that has the exposure episode as well, so you can go see episode number 1. Alright guys, well I will see you guys on the next one, and hopefully you guys are healthy, staying safe, and take it easy, okay? Peace out.